William Penn was a great military man. He was not the most ethical of men. Many people in this society may know that I'm referring to Admiral William Penn. He fought on the side of Parliament during the years when the monarchy had been ousted in England. And at the same time, he maintained a private correspondence with the royal family, and particularly ingratiated himself to the Duke of York, who I believe was the future James II, and ended up providing military service to the royal family in conflicts, particularly with the Dutch, and in return for that service was rewarded with a charter for a grant of land in America. But he passed away before that was completed, and so it was inherited by his son, also named William Penn, and the William Penn most people, of course, think of with Pennsylvania. Portraitly, a very different man, but I think a very different man altogether than his father. And I don't know that much about their biographies, but I can't help but wonder if it wasn't in part because of his father that William Penn converted to the Quaker faith. As far as I know, was an extremely ethical man, and most important for this discussion, he was a pacifist by virtue of his Quaker tradition. And William Penn's his pacifist principles are embedded to this day in the boundaries of Pennsylvania. Penn knew that the land that he would be getting would be west of the Delaware River. And at the time, 1681, there were Dutch inhabitants who, not only up in New York along the Hudson, but down through present-day New Jersey, and then down into present-day Delaware. In fact, the settlement that Penn planned was located at the juncture of the Delaware River and a river that has a Dutch name, the Schuylkill. He did not want his charter, the boundaries in his charter, to bring him into conflict that could become violent with any of the communities that were already established with Dutch inhabitants. And so he asked that that the boundary comes no closer than 12 miles to the Dutch settlement at Newcastle. That circle around Newcastle that you're seeing is today the semicircle at the top of Delaware, although it is more properly thought of as the semicircle in the southeastern corner of Pennsylvania, because it is a remnant, it's a vestige, an artifact right there on the ground today of William Penn's Quaker and pacifist principles. The charter that created Pennsylvania then specified that we'll have this 12-mile buffer. The eastern border will then be the Delaware River, but only up to the 43rd parallel. Now, in 1681, they really didn't know just how far the Delaware River was or where exactly the 41st parallel is. So the charter also says, if it doesn't make it to the 41st parallel, just from the source go due north till you get to the 41st parallel. Well, it turns out it just doesn't make it to the 41st parallel. I'm sorry, the 43rd parallel. And from that 43rd parallel, the charter says it goes west 5 degrees, then it goes south to the 40th parallel, and then the charter says it goes east to the point where it intersects the semicircle. Oops. They don't intersect. So right off the bat, William Penn had a problem. In fact, it was a little more serious than just, can we make this intersect, because the 40th parallel is right in the middle of the city we're in today. I think it's about a mile north of here. It wasn't quite so easy to fix, because pre-existing to this, already established as a colony, was Maryland. And the Charter of Maryland said that its northern border was the 40th parallel. So they already had claim, although they had not occupied it yet, to this land that included the greater part of the city of Philadelphia. So William Penn, right off the bat, had a boundary problem. In fact, he had another boundary problem because New York claimed that its boundaries extended as far as you're seeing into Pennsylvania. New York at the time, actually a little later, but by the time you get to the Revolution, New York also included Vermont. Vermont, just as a side note, was not one of our 13 original colonies. So William Penn had two problems. Actually, there was also a third problem, and it also related to a colony that predated Pennsylvania, the Plymouth colony, which was created in 1620. And then 9 years later, it was subdivided to create the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And just to fast forward to the time when Pennsylvania gets created, colonies had spun off, and this is a situation that William Penn was looking at. Massachusetts was essentially the state that it is today, but it also, up through and after the Revolution, included what is today the state of Maine. More importantly for Pennsylvania was this spin-off colony of Connecticut, because Connecticut maintained that its borders still extended as far west as those that had originally applied under the charters of Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony. Actually, Connecticut was much more reasonable than that. The original charters said that it went to the Pacific Ocean. By this point in time, England's claims only went to the Mississippi River, and Connecticut said, well, you know what, we'll be happy just going to Sandusky, which is the western end of what it calls its Western Reserve. It also didn't lay claim to land that was already inhabited in Delaware and New York. But it did claim this swath of land through Pennsylvania and into Ohio. There's a ghost of this claim today in Cleveland, in the name Case Western Reserve University, the Western Reserve being Connecticut's name. So William Penn had, in fact, three problems, actually four problems, because another pre-existing colony was Virginia, dating back to 1609. Its original charter, when they created Jamestown, gave Jamestown a lot of room to grow. What you're really seeing here is England jockeying for position with Spain and France and Holland, laying out their claims to the New World. But nevertheless, that was the original charter. Again, let's just fast forward to when Pennsylvania gets created. Virginia is still huge, but it's much more modestly bordered. But there is a part of Virginia, the part that borders the Monongahela River, that Virginia still lays a serious claim to, and it conflicts with Pennsylvania's claim. And that little corner will prove a little more difficult than one might expect just from the size of it. So of these four conflicts that he had, as if he didn't have enough to do just getting a colony going, the one that's most pressing to Pennsylvania and to William Penn is the one with Maryland, because of the issue of Philadelphia. And so William Penn is in a position where he is negotiating with Lord Baltimore, the third Lord Baltimore, who's the proprietor of Maryland. Just this negotiation gets complicated. The initial complication, simply, Lord Baltimore by this point is actually a pretty old man, and he passes away. So William Penn is genealogical, because it's still proprietors in some of these colonies. He's dealing with the fourth Lord Baltimore. Maryland was a Catholic colony. The relationship of Catholics to the monarchy in England was always a little dicey, a little on again, off again. After Benedict Calvert, it went off again, and a Protestant government was put into Maryland. So now William Penn is dealing with a man named William Joseph. I had to use his Facebook picture. After William Joseph, there's a man named John Coode he's dealing with. Then he's dealing with a man named Nehemiah Blackiston. Then he's dealing with 14 other guys, while England is now trying to sort out the best way to govern its crown colonies in New England and even down as far as Maryland. That would not include Delaware, but rather the crown colonies. And then finally, we've got a Calvert back in the governorship. But by this point, William Penn's an old man, and he passes away. And so now this negotiation about, hey, is Philadelphia ours or theirs, passes to his sons, Thomas Penn and Richard Penn. Thomas Penn inherited 75% of the proprietorship, Richard Penn 25%, but Thomas Penn had no issue, no children. Richard Penn did, so the line will actually pass through Richard Penn. They're now negotiating with Charles Calvert, who passes away, and now it's Benedict Leonard Calvert. And then there's more upheaval in Maryland, then it's a man named Samuel Ogle, and finally we get to the 5th Lord Baltimore before they finally, at this point, will be able to negotiate what the boundary will be. When we think about negotiation, I think what comes to our mind is you say 6, I say 4, we settle on 5, something like that. I found in writing this book, because a lot of our boundaries were done by treaty, that that's very rarely the way these negotiations happen. More often than not, there's a third party. There's no other matrix that's critical to negotiation. And while you may think the US and England are negotiating a boundary, really we're negotiating with the people in Maine, in the case of Maine, or we're negotiating with the members of our own political party in the case of the Oregon Territory or something. In this one, too, there's a whole third party that's critical to the way this thing plays out, and that's a man named Augustine Herman. He's Dutch, and it predates the creation of Pennsylvania. It goes back before William Penn's arrival. Charles Calvert, that 3rd Lord Baltimore that William Penn began with, was a Catholic, and he issued a proclamation that said that all the Protestant Dutch inhabitants in this eastern part of my colony, which at that point, by its, what we call Delaware today, is all in Maryland's charter, must leave. When the word got to Peter Stuyvesant in New York, he dispatched Augustine Herman and a man named Resolved Waldron to come down and point out to Lord Baltimore that that's illegal. It was really Herman who ended up taking the lead in this meeting. And Stuyvesant gave Augustine Herman very clear instructions that the treaty that existed between England and Holland said that though the Dutch authorities were no longer in power in what's now Delaware, that the inhabitants can keep their land and their titles. And he's violating, what was it, the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 16th articles of this treaty. What he didn't tell Augustine Herman is, and what do I do if Lord Baltimore says, so what? Do we go to war? I mean, So Augustine Herman does this, but he does other things too. And what's interesting to me about this, if you will, kind of from a genealogical point of view, is Augustine Herman is Dutch. He's a very successful merchant, but he wasn't born in Holland. He was born in Bohemia. Bohemia is an area that is in Eastern Europe. It's between much larger powers. Germanic powers to the west, Slavic powers to the east. Here is Bohemia in 1547. Pretty fluid boundaries. People in Bohemia, this is somewhat just my kind of take on this, need to know how to cope with more powerful neighbors. Boundaries to them, So, and growing up as a child, even after they moved to Holland, his parents saw to it that he was educated and skilled in a number of things. Again, it's like coping with what you may encounter. So he certainly was very skilled at business. He was also very skilled in the law, because he pointed out to Charles Calvert that in the charter that created Maryland, it says that they're creating a colony, and here's the quote from the charter, in a country hitherto uncultivated, in the parts of America, and partly occupied by savages having no knowledge of the divine being. That's just a phrase from a sentence, but he honed in on that phrase, and he said, sir, the area you're talking about is under cultivation by people with a knowledge of the divine being, the Dutch. Therefore, it actually is not part of Maryland. Lord Baltimore said, forget about it. The technical loophole, not going to, and so that didn't turn the corner either. In the course of, this wasn't just one meeting, he was down there for a while, and in the course of their encounters, he had another skill that his parents had seen to it that he had, which was he was a surveyor. He also learned how to make maps. And he said to, let's get down to this, to Calvert, by the way, just you me, I'm a map maker. And if you'd like a map of the settlements that Maryland has now and so forth, you know, I'll do one for you. And he said, well, how much? And he said, well, let me do the map, see what you think. He said, yeah, do a map. That is Augustine Herman's map. That's a pretty good map. That's a map that's showing you the Chesapeake Bay, and you can see the Delaware Bay just above it. This is, you know, from before Pennsylvania was even created. This is before 1680. It was far and away the finest map of its time. The importance of it is that it was such a good map that Lord Baltimore said, wow, hey, look, tell you what, just you and me now. This doesn't have to do with the rest of these Dutch people. If you would like some land, I'll give you some land. And Herman said, that'd be great. And then they decide where it was, and Herman said, well, could it be here in this region? Which it is, by the way. Now that boundary that exists between Maryland and Delaware today, that didn't exist yet. So look what he's done. He's created a little Bohemia. He's gotten land that he personally has title to that straddles this area. If you think I'm making too much of this Bohemia business, keep in mind that that large river that extends into the land he was given, he named, and it's still named, the Bohemia River. And if you were to go there today, not only would you see the Bohemia River, you would see Bohemia Mills, along with Port Herman. And this is my favorite, given that Maryland was a Catholic colony. Augustine Herman was not Catholic. St. Augustine. So Augustine Herman plays it pretty well. But by the time we now get to where we left off with the 5th Lord Baltimore and the Penn brothers, Augustine Herman has gotten very old and he passed away. But it is, again, sort of genealogically, if you will, his son who takes over in his stead. And he also picks up on this other dimension in the negotiation that I mentioned, which was begun by Augustine Herman, but it was really Ephraim Herman who played it, which is to connect with these two Penn brothers and to point out, hey guys, you do not want the Dutch area going to Maryland. You want it to stay us and the Dutch. Because if it goes to Maryland, and if there's hostile feelings between Maryland and Pennsylvania, Maryland can very easily stop commerce down the Delaware River. If you look at this at the map there, you know, it's and if it does that, then Pennsylvania is landlocked because they cannot get their commerce down the Delaware River to the Delaware Bay and the sea. And they go as if they needed the tutorial. By golly, you're right. And they combine forces in this negotiation for Delaware not to be included in Maryland. England rules on this, and they rule in favor of Delaware and Pennsylvania. Here's an interesting point. In the official ruling, the reason they cite the Charter of Maryland and that phrase that Augustine Herman was the first one to call out and say, hey, folks, pay attention to this. And that was England's, the one about cultivated land by people not knowing the divine being. That was the Crown's basis for saying, no, actually, this is not part of Maryland. So they have agreed in principle, there will be a separate Delaware, and then it's just, so where will the lines be? The 5th Lord Baltimore says, well, look, if this Delaware area doesn't go any further south than the southernmost Dutch settlement at Cape Henlopen, then the Pennsylvania-Maryland border can be located 15 miles south of South Street in Philadelphia. And they say, cool, good deal. The map you're looking at is the map they were using, or if it was printed, one copy of it. This map is from the Library of Congress. And they were all good with it. Is everyone here good with it? I'm not good with it. Neither was Lord Baltimore very shortly, because can you see Cape Henlopen on the map? That's not Cape Henlopen. Cape Henlopen is up at the very left bottom of Delaware Bay. It was an error on the map. The area that's identified on this old map as Cape Henlopen is Fenwick Island, 20 miles further south. When Lord Baltimore discovered this, he said, whoa, time out, we have to do a do-over. England said, no do-overs, we're done. These will be the borders. And what's stipulated is from that line, whether it's Cape Henlopen or not, there will be a transpeninsular line across that eastern shore peninsula. It will then bisect the land up to the border of Maryland. It's Delaware, except what you're looking at now is not what the stipulations were from that map, because, as it turns out, there's your 12-mile circle, there's your transpeninsular line, and there's the line that bisects the land. It cuts into the circle. So what happens now that we get, how do we get from this to this? A lot more bickering, a lot more arguing over this surveyor or that. And finally, the solution comes when Maryland and Virginia, they realize there's no, they're going to have to find simply the optimum boundary. There's no perfect solution. And they agree to get, as totally unbiased surveyors, two of the finest scientists in England, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, to come over and survey this line. Getting Mason and Dixon to survey a line is like getting Mozart to play at the senior prom. And by the way, although there's no document that has ever been uncovered to prove this, it's widely believed that the connection to Mason and Dixon was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was, this is before the Revolution, he was a great scientist. He was in the London, a member of the Royal Society of London for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge, the most prestigious scientific society in the English-speaking world, as were Mason and Dixon. And the belief is that he was the one who provided that connection. So here then is what we call the Mason-Dixon line, but it really are the Mason-Dixon lines. And again, just a sidebar, they have nothing to do with slavery. This is 1763 to 1767. Slavery is not regulated. Any colony that wants slavery can have it. It's getting controversial. There are some colonies, this being one of them, that are in the process of abolishing it. But the line has nothing to do with the issue of slavery. When I discovered that, I thought, well, when did it come into use as this kind of line about free states and slave states? And again, just as a sidebar, if we jump back to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, when Jefferson acquired this land, the question came up, can there be slavery in the Louisiana Purchase? It was resolved in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, written by Henry Clay. And the Missouri Compromise said, no new state or territory north of 36 degrees 30 minutes, that's basically the southern border of most of Missouri, can have slavery. Below that, they can, with the exception of Missouri, which is why it's a compromise. But the point here is, it's a line. A line was used to distinguish where slavery could exist and couldn't. And it's very shortly after that that one starts to see in print references to Mason and Dixon's line in the same way. The first reference I could find, I'm sure there were earlier ones that just didn't get into print, was only 4 years later. Congressman John Randolph of Virginia said on the floor of the House, he began a sentence by saying, "We who are so unfortunate as to live south of Mason and Dixon's line at east of the Appalachians." Pretty soon the Appalachians drop out of the shorthand, and it becomes this inaccurate but common shorthand for slavery. So Pennsylvania has resolved its problem with Maryland and the border of Maryland. Let's turn to New York. But the point I want to stress here is these remaining problems, New York, Connecticut, Virginia, they're all playing out simultaneously. And in one instance, they're actually impacting on one another. But it will make most sense if we begin with the issue of the northern border with New York. New York maintained that when the charter said the 43rd parallel, that a parallel was not a line, but a band of width 1 degree wide. So that the 43rd parallel was the parallel between the 42nd degrees and 43 degrees. That was the 43rd parallel. They didn't make this up out of thin air. There were cartographers, geographers who thought of latitude that way, but it was pretty outmoded by this point in time. But Pennsylvania couldn't really dismiss it as that because back when they were negotiating with Maryland, William Penn used the same argument. He said, oh, it's a band of width. Really, our boundary goes way down. So, hey, how about give us Philadelphia? There was another problem with New York's claim, and that was that it provided no access to Lake Erie for Pennsylvania if they got the land they wanted. Even though this is before the Erie Canal, you could still go from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, probably a good idea to portage around Niagara Falls, to the St. Lawrence River, to the sea. And before the Revolution, one colony, British colony, is the same as another British colony. Even after the Revolution, the treaty that ended the Revolution provided navigational rights to the United States along the St. Lawrence. After the Revolution, this problem was pretty readily solved, quite frankly, once Congress was in place, and that was that Pennsylvania granted New York the boundary it wanted in return for New York relinquishing its claim to any land west of Lake Ontario. It's one of these things like, what? Lake Ontario? But if Lake Ontario is the higher lake there, and if you follow it due south, you'll see it picked up by that little white area. That land would then come to Pennsylvania and provide the tab that to this day is in the northwestern corner of Pennsylvania. Most important thing about that tab is it has a port, the city of Erie. So they were able to resolve the problem with New York, but with resolving the problem with New York, it exacerbated the problem with Virginia. Because the question with Virginia for the western border is 5 degrees west of where? The New York Agreement just obliterated the starting point, the original starting point for going 5 degrees west. This was very important to Virginia because Virginia had already deeded land along the Ohio River, along the eastern side of the Ohio River, because after the French and Indian War, England said no settlements can be west of the Ohio. It's one of the reasons we had a revolution. And the Ohio River flows to the Mississippi and to the Gulf. For the mountainous western areas of what was then Virginia, the Ohio River was absolutely critical to their commerce. But critical to Pennsylvania was the point where the Monongahela River joins with the Allegheny River to create the Ohio River, because they knew that would be incredibly valuable prop area. Today it's Pittsburgh. And they did not want to lose that. Again, they were able to resolve it after the Revolution relatively quickly and certainly peacefully. And that was that they said 5 degrees west of where? 5 degrees west of where the Delaware River crosses the latitude of Maryland's northern border. This is one of these descriptions when you read it in a treaty or an agreement where the eyes spin. But let's follow that. You can see the Delaware River in red. If you follow it down and then into the eastern side of Delaware to that black arrow, that's the point where it crosses the northern border, the latitude, rather, of the northern border of Maryland. And if you follow it from that point, 5 degrees to the west, that would be the western border of Pennsylvania. And it is to this day. So the problem with Virginia was resolved. Virginia retained its frontage on the Ohio River. Today, that's now West Virginia, because West Virginia split away during the Civil War. And Pittsburgh, of course, stays clearly within Pennsylvania. So this only leaves Connecticut. You know, hey, Connecticut, there, compared to New York and Pennsylvania. In 1759, Connecticut started to act on these claims I mentioned. They created something called the Susquehanna Company, which sold land in the what they called the Western Reserve. And the initial land that they sold is around what is today Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, an area called the Wyoming Valley. By 10 years later, they were really getting pretty sizable, these settlements. So Governor John Penn, this is the son of Richard Penn, that son who had children of William Penn, very unquakerly sends a militia in, and he just ousts these Connecticut settlers. That's because John Penn was not a Quaker, nor was his father, Richard. They, and who knows why, but left the Quaker faith and returned either to the Anglican Church or another Protestant church. and that were not pacifists, and he had no problem sending in the militia in 1769. 1 year later, the people from Connecticut return. They come under the leadership of a man named John Durkee and Zebulon Butler. Butler becomes really, as the story goes on, really the man who leads Connecticut's forces and community in this conflict. And the way they come back is that they enlist as shock troops a group called the Paxton Boys. Now, the Paxton Boys were not like some hillbilly family named Paxton or something like that. They were Irish and Scottish settlers in a town further into Pennsylvania called Paxton. Paxton is today a neighborhood in Harrisburg. Just again, sort of sidebar, you can see down near the bottom of the map, I did some little circling of Paxton Street. My guess is that's probably the old road that went from the Susquehanna River to Paxton. And I see a street kind of through a diagonal there called Derry Street. I can't help but wonder, since it violates the grid that Harrisburg eventually used, if that doesn't date back to the Irish members of settlers from there. The Paxton Boys had a pretty rough reputation in Pennsylvania. In 1763, right after the French and Indian War, they formed a vigilante and massacred Native Americans, men, women, children. It was such a dastardly act. It was condemned by Governor John Penn. It was condemned by Benjamin Franklin in his newspaper. They had a pretty unsavory, they were not particularly welcome citizens of Pennsylvania. But Connecticut welcomed them, and they came in and they did the initial assault and it was followed up by the people from Connecticut, so that in 1770, the Connecticut settlers are back. Well, at this point, the conflict goes to the king. Is this Connecticut or is this Pennsylvania? The king is George III. It's 1770, and he's in no hurry to resolve this, because these American colonies are becoming really rebellious, giving them a lot of trouble. Some of them are even talking about uniting into things called states. The best thing from the king's point of view is let this fester. Let these two colonies keep arguing with each other and fighting with each other. That'll just, put off their turning against me. In 1774, Governor Penn realizes the king is not going to do anything. I'm going to have to take this into my own hands again. And he issues a proclamation. It's published in the Pennsylvania Gazette. I have a little copy of it here and some excerpts. I just want to read from the excerpts, if you will, excerpts from the excerpt that point to how Zebulon Butler was really now the man that was the thorn in Pennsylvania's side. He says in this excerpt, and again I'm excerpting from it, I have received information that a certain Zebulon Butler, under pretense of authority from the government of Connecticut, has presumed to issue an advertisement setting forth that the General Assembly of the colony of Connecticut has appointed him a justice of the peace for the county of Litchfield, Litchfield being a Connecticut name. A little further on, toward the end of the thing, just another quick excerpt. I do hereby strictly prohibit and forbid the inhabitants of the said counties of Northampton and Northumberland, those were Pennsylvania names, and all other inhabitants of this province to yield any obedience or to pay the least regard whatsoever to the aforesaid Benjamin Butler. During this time that they were waiting for the king, they were prospering, these Connecticut colonies. And when John Penn issued this proclamation, Zebulon Butler responded. He responded by starting another Connecticut colony. It's there on the map. It's called Warrior Run. It's a little waterway that goes into the Susquehanna further west. But look where he's located this. Not only is he further west in his claim, he's putting it right down there near the southernmost extent of Connecticut's claim. I mean, that's really a taunt, if you will, that he knows Pennsylvania will have to respond to, because he knows, and Governor Penn knows, if I don't respond to this, our claim is going to be very much weakened. So not only is it brilliantly located in that respect, but because he knows John Penn is going to respond, it has another aspect that doesn't show up on this map. It's on high ground, and he builds fortifications to defend it. And in December 1775, troops from Pennsylvania attack the settlement at Warrior Run, and they're repelled because of such a strong defensive position. So Butler has really done a pretty good job of exerting that claim. 1 year later, these troops from Pennsylvania and the forces from Connecticut are fighting side by side in the American Revolution. And this whole issue is put on the side burner with one episode of exception that's called the Wyoming Massacre in 1788. And it also has an interesting genealogical kind of piece to it. This event that's called the Wyoming Massacre was covered in the Pennsylvania Evening Post that I have kind of in the background there. But again, let me just read you excerpts from two parts of that, which sort of describe what the Pennsylvania Evening Post was telling the readers happened. Basically, the setup is that Colonel Zebulon Butler of the American forces realized that he's around Wilkes-Barre. Enemy forces come into the region. They're not British. They're under the command of Tory General John Butler, his cousin, also from Connecticut, but supporting the king. And his men supported the king. Also in his troops are a lot of Native Americans who felt that they'd get a better shake with England than if this country becomes the United States, and gee, they might push them off their land. This larger enemy force, if you will, comes into the region. In this first excerpt, it says, the whole body of the enemy, consisting of near 1,600, about 300 of whom were thought to be Indians, the rest Tories painted like them, the whole under the command of Colonel John Butler, a Connecticut Tory and cousin to Colonel Zebulon Butler, came down but concealed the greatest part of their number. There's then a battle. It's very quickly, the British, or the enemy, if you will, very quickly scatter Zebulon Butler's men in the confrontation. So an excerpt from further in that article says, the enemy took away some of the unhappy prisoners and shutting up the rest in the houses set fire to them, and they were all consumed together. These infernals then crossed the river to Fort Wilkes-Barre, which surrendered. About 7 of the men they inhumanly butchered with every circumstance of horrid cruelty, and then shutting up the rest with the women and children in the houses, they set fire to them, and they all perished together in the flames. Since then, historians have added only that that never happened. What actually is widely accepted as the truth is that there was this first encounter. Butler and his men retreat into a fort. Among his men are the Paxton boys. They are terrified, and they're waiting for reinforcements. They're terrified, these Paxton boys. And this isn't a small group. I mean, that's not a family again. This is a body of men from an area in Harrisburg. That if that fort is taken before reinforcements come, these Indians are it's gonna be payback time. And they're now gonna be in fear for their lives. Butler isn't sure that they're wrong. He doesn't know when reinforcements will come. And so reluctantly he agrees, and they counterattack. They are quickly vanquished by John Butler and his forces. And in fact, and Zebulon Butler orders a retreat. Not everybody gets the message in the confusion of the moment. And at that point, it becomes payback time. The Native Americans fighting with Tory General John Butler begin to butcher and horrendously murder all the American troops that they get their hands on. Tory troops, the Connecticut soldiers who were Tories, actually tried to restrain them, but it was a no-go. The Indians then do set fire to the homes in the area, and they plunder them. But they did not harm a single woman or child. And in fact, those homeless women and children were given sanctuary by Colonel John Butler in his fort, and he offered compensation for the property that was damaged. But it's wartime, and propaganda in wartime is as nasty then and as tilted then as it is today. After the Revolution, Congress finally does rule on this issue, and they rule in favor of Pennsylvania's claim to the land. There are still a number of people in the Wilkes-Barre area who do not want to accept this, and they are going to resist it militarily. And they turn to Zebulon Butler and say, will you lead us again? But Butler is an older man now. His fighting days are done. And he says, no, and I think you're wrong. I think we should accept the decision. This will become Lucerne County, I think it is today, and go through the process of trying to have our claims recognized. Pennsylvania wasn't going to just disown them from their claims, but a long process. But there were some skirmishes. Butler was not part of them. Obviously, they couldn't hold up against Congress and Pennsylvania's forces. And so Pennsylvania, at this point, acquires the shape that is familiar to us today, but for one wedge issue that remained, and that was the wedge. The wedge refers to, although Mason and Dixon did the best they couldn't make it perfect. And so there's this little piece of land between where their line comes up to Maryland and that semicircle that's called the wedge. And the question was, what state does that belong to? Maryland never really exerted much of an effort for it. So the question was really Pennsylvania or Delaware. These are two 19th century maps from right around the same time. One of them, the one on the left, is showing the wedge area as being part of Delaware. The one on the right is showing it as part of Pennsylvania. Not until 1921 was it resolved, when Congress passed a resolution saying it belonged to Delaware. And with that, we can see how Pennsylvania went from what it was originally in 1681 to what it is today in 2012. Thank you very much.